Ronnie James Dio was the heavy metal vocalist and songwriter. Died Sunday was posted on his official website and confirmed by a public.
Ronnie James Dio spent more than 5 decades building one of the most recognizable and instantly identifiable voices in the entire history of rock and metal music. But the strangest part of his story didn't happen while he was alive. It happened after he died, when the people closest to him had to decide what to do with everything he left behind: half-finished songs, decades of unreleased recordings, and a legacy that would eventually be turned into a hologram. What they chose to do with it split his fan base and pulled one of the most respected voices in metal journalism into open criticism of the very people trying to honor him. This is the real, fully documented story of what actually happened to Ronnie James Dio's estate after he was gone. Before he was Dio, he was Ronald James Padavona, born in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on July 10, 1942, and raised in Cortland, New York, in a tight-knit Italian-American household. Music wasn't a suggestion in that house. It was closer to an expectation. His father had him on trumpet as a young boy, and by the time he was a teenager, he was already playing in bands, developing the kind of disciplined ear that would later let him sing with the range and control almost nobody in rock music could match. He certainly didn't start out chasing myth, fantasy, and grand operatic theatrics the way people remember him now. His earliest bands worked the doo-wop and rockabilly club circuit around upstate New York, playing covers for crowds that had no idea they were watching a future icon. Along the way, he adopted the stage name Dio, borrowing it from a name he'd heard associated with organized crime in the era, not out of admiration, but because the word itself, Italian for God, gave him something bigger to grow into. It's one of those details that tends to surprise people. The man who'd spend his career singing about rainbows, dragons, and holy fire took his name from the underworld, not the heavens. For a stretch in the late 1950s, Ronnie was actually on a completely different track. He'd enrolled at the University at Buffalo with an eye toward pharmacology, the kind of stable, respectable career path a lot of immigrant families in that era pushed their kids toward, one that had absolutely nothing to do with stages or spotlights. Music kept pulling harder, though, and eventually he made his choice, walking away from that path entirely to chase something far less secure. It's easy to forget, watching footage of him decades later commanding arenas with a voice that seemed built for opera houses, that he spent years playing cover songs in small clubs for crowds who barely noticed him, building his craft one unglamorous gig at a time long before anyone outside those clubs knew his name. He eventually formed a band called Elf, and it was there that his sound really started shifting away from doo-wop and rockabilly toward the heavier, more ambitious rock that would come to define the rest of his career. Elf never became a household name, but it did something more important for Ronnie's trajectory. It put him in a room with the right people, and it gave him a chance to develop the songwriting instincts that would carry him through everything that came after. By the time Rainbow came calling, Ronnie had already spent close to 2 decades in the industry's lower tiers, which is part of why he never seemed to treat fame the way a lot of overnight successes tend to. He'd earned every bit of its slow way, and it showed in how seriously he took the craft once the bigger stages finally arrived. By the mid-1970s, after grinding through bar bands for nearly 2 decades, Ronnie caught the attention of Ritchie Blackmore, the guitarist who had just left Deep Purple and was assembling a new project called Rainbow. It was an unlikely pairing on paper. Blackmore's classically influenced guitar worked against Ronnie's taste for medieval imagery and myth, but it produced some of the most ambitious hard rock of the decade. Albums like Rainbow Rising gave Ronnie the platform to show off both his voice and his imagination, and for the first time, audiences were hearing the fully formed version of the artist he'd spend the rest of his life being. The partnership eventually wore thin, not through some explosive blow-up, but through a simple mismatch in direction. Blackmore wanted Rainbow to move toward a more radio-friendly sound, and Ronnie's entire identity was built on the fantastical, the operatic, the mythic. By 1979, he was out, and a different singer was brought in to finish the pivot Blackmore wanted. For most performers, getting quietly nudged out of a band right as it changes direction is where the story ends. For Ronnie, it was the beginning of the most improbable chapter of his career. Later that same year, Black Sabbath needed a new singer. Ozzy Osbourne, the band's founding frontman, had exited the group amid growing tension, and Sabbath's future was genuinely uncertain. Ozzy wasn't just a singer to the band's audience. For a lot of fans, he was Black Sabbath, and stepping into that role looked less like an opportunity and more like a career-ending assignment. Ronnie took it anyway, and the results silenced almost every doubt. Heaven and Hell in 1980 and Mob Rules in 1981 gave the band a completely different sound and, remarkably, a second creative peak. Both albums are still counted among the strongest work Sabbath ever released, a genuinely rare feat for a band replacing its most iconic voice. Ronnie's love of myth and grandeur, the same style that hadn't fit Blackmore's new commercial direction, turned out to be precisely what Sabbath needed to reinvent itself for a new decade. It was also during this stretch that Ronnie popularized the devil horns hand gesture that's now instantly recognizable at metal shows around the world. By his own account, he picked it up from his Italian grandmother, who used the gesture superstitiously to ward off bad luck. A small, personal, almost folkloric detail that ended up becoming one of the most universally understood symbols in music, adopted by fans who've likely never heard the story behind it. The lineup that had rescued Sabbath's momentum didn't hold together for long. In 1982, a dispute over how a live album was being mixed led Ronnie and drummer Vinny Appice to walk out together, both feeling their contributions weren't being represented fairly. Rather than fight it out, Ronnie simply left and started his own band under the name Dio, releasing Holy Diver in 1983, an album that became a defining record of 80s metal in its own right and gave him total creative control for the first time in his career. Sabbath and Ronnie tried again in 1992 for an album called Dehumanizer, but the same old tensions resurfaced almost immediately, and that reunion also produced exactly one record before dissolving. A third attempt, years later, finally stuck for a while. In 2006, Ronnie reunited with Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Vinny Appice under the name Heaven and Hell, a deliberate rebrand meant to separate this version of the band from the Ozzy-fronted lineup, touring at the same time. That configuration released The Devil You Know in 2009, their first full album of new material together in decades, and it was met with the kind of reviews that suggested this lineup still had something real left to say to a modern audience. Something was wrong with Ronnie during that final tour. Even if nobody around him understood exactly what yet, he was in real pain some nights, pushing through full sets after doubling over backstage, while the people closest to him had no idea how serious it had become. He and his wife, Wendy, had already gone through a round of tests for ongoing digestive issues before the tour started, and everything had come back clear at the time. The tour continued all the way to what would turn out to be his final concert on August 29, 2009, in Atlantic City. Nobody in that audience knew they were watching Ronnie James Dio perform live for the last time. Just months later, in November 2009, Ronnie was diagnosed with stomach cancer. The reality behind that diagnosis was harsher than the early public statement suggested. By the time doctors caught it, the disease had already progressed to an advanced stage. He underwent aggressive treatment, first at the Mayo Clinic and later at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, while staying publicly optimistic about beating it. In April 2010, he made his final public appearance, attending the Revolver Golden Gods Awards in person to accept the award for Best Metal Singer, an appearance that gave a lot of fans real hope he might pull through. He didn't. Ronnie James Dio died on May 16, 2010, at 67 years old, with close friends and family able to say goodbye beforehand. His wife's statement afterward described a broken heart, but also gratitude for how deeply he'd been loved by fans across the world. That's usually where a musician's story ends in the public eye. For Ronnie, it was really just the point where a much stranger and more complicated story began, the story of what actually happened to everything he left behind. Long before any of the archive questions or hologram debates came up, there was a simpler, more immediate reality. Someone had to run everything Ronnie left behind, and that someone was Wendy. She wasn't just his wife. For decades, she'd been his manager, the person negotiating his contracts, shaping his business decisions, and, by most accounts, protecting him from the kind of predatory deals that quietly wrecked plenty of other musicians of his generation. When he died, that working relationship didn't end. It just changed shape entirely, shifting from managing a living, working artist's career to managing something far more permanent, A legacy. That transition wasn't always smooth in the public eye. For years, persistent rumors circulated online claiming that Wendy and Ronnie had secretly separated or divorced at some point before his death. The kind of unfounded gossip that tends to attach itself to any famous marriage once one half of the couple is gone and can't personally correct the record. Wendy has had to address it directly, repeatedly, in interviews, flatly denying it and making clear the two of them were together until the day he died. It's a strange, uncomfortable position to be in. Not just grieving a husband, but having to publicly defend the nature of that marriage against internet speculation while also trying to steward everything he built. Beyond the archive and the hologram, Wendy also became the driving force behind the Ronnie James Dio Stand Up and Shout Cancer Fund, established not long after his death specifically to support cancer research and raise public awareness around the disease that took him. The fund has grown into an annual fixture in the rock and metal community, built around recurring fundraising events like motorcycle rides and bowling tournaments that draw musicians, industry figures, and fans who never got the chance to say goodbye while Ronnie was alive. Proceeds from a later tribute album, featuring major artists covering songs from across his catalog, were funneled back into that same cause, turning a personal tragedy into an ongoing, tangible source of support for other families dealing with the same disease. It's worth sitting with how much work that actually represents. Running a record label and management company, defending a decades-long marriage against baseless rumors, building and sustaining a charitable foundation, and simultaneously deciding, song by song, what does and doesn't meet a dead man's own impossibly high standards. All of that fell to one person, largely out of public view, in the years immediately following the worst day of her life. After his death, Wendy Dio took over full control of his legacy, continuing to run Niji Entertainment, the label and management company the two of them had built together over decades. Contrary to the kind of legend that tends to grow around dead musicians, the sealed-off room nobody dares enter, untouched for years, the reality of what actually happened with Ronnie's archive is a lot more hands-on than that. Wendy has described in multiple interviews over the years, regularly going through a climate-controlled storage space where Ronnie's recordings, notebooks, and unfinished material are kept, all carefully labeled. She said she finds things constantly. A lyric sheet here, a half-finished demo there, and that some of it genuinely surprises her, even years after his death. But she's also been consistent and public about one rule. Nothing gets released just because it exists. Estimates on how many truly unfinished songs are sitting in that archive have shifted depending on the interview. Sometimes described as 3, sometimes as many as 5 or 6, some barely sketched out as ideas, others closer to complete with Ronnie's vocals already recorded over a full band arrangement. What all of those interviews agree on is the standard. Any of it that eventually gets released has to pass through trusted ears first, people who worked with Ronnie directly, to make sure it actually reflects the level of quality he demanded of himself throughout his career. That's a genuinely different posture than what usually happens after a major musician dies. The music industry has a long, well-documented pattern of taking a dead artist's leftover scraps, polishing them up with modern production, and brushing them out within a year or two to catch a wave of public grief and nostalgia while it's still commercially useful. Wendy's approach, sitting on material for over a decade rather than releasing something unfinished under Ronnie's name, is closer to the exception than the rule in an industry that usually can't resist moving fast on a dead star's leftover work. That patience, though, didn't extend to everything connected to his legacy. One decision in particular ended up testing how far his fan base was willing to go in accepting a version of Ronnie that wasn't entirely, well, him. In 2016, a production company called iLusion built a hologram of Ronnie James Dio and debuted it at Wacken Open Air, one of the biggest metal festivals in the world, in front of a crowd of more than 75,000 people. 3 years later, that hologram went on an actual tour, backed by a live band made up of Ronnie's former collaborators, syncing his real archival vocal recordings to a digitally rendered projection of his likeness on stage rather than any kind of synthesized or AI-generated voice. The response was immediately divided. Some fans, especially ones who never got the chance to see Ronnie perform live, described the experience as genuinely moving, a way to stand in a room and hear those songs performed the way they were meant to be heard, with a real band underneath a familiar voice. Others found it deeply unsettling, describing the visual as landing somewhere in the uncanny valley, close enough to human to feel wrong rather than comforting. The strongest public criticism came from Kerrang, one of the most respected outlets in metal journalism, which published a piece bluntly stating that the hologram needed to stop entirely. The publication argued that what made Ronnie special in the first place was his humanity. The way his lyrics about outsiders, monsters, and impossible odds were really metaphors for very human struggles, and that projecting a digital recreation of him on stage for ticket sales cheapened exactly the thing that made him worth remembering in the first place. It's a rare thing to see a major music publication take that direct a stance against a deceased artist's own estate. Doug Aldrich, who played guitar in Ronnie's band for years but wasn't involved in the hologram project, went even further in interviews, suggesting Ronnie himself would have hated the entire idea, that he was a no-frills performer who valued musicianship over spectacle, and that the concept of being digitally resurrected to headline a tour would have genuinely irritated him. Wendy defended the project publicly for years, arguing that critics were entitled to their opinions but should see the show in person before dismissing it, and that the fans who actually attended tended to leave with a positive reaction. But financially, the numbers told a rougher story. She stated in multiple interviews that the hologram cost well over $2 million to build and stage, and that, years later, that investment still hadn't been recovered. Eventually, she described the hologram as an experiment she wasn't eager to repeat, shifting future tribute shows toward restored archival concert footage, paired with a live band instead. A version of Ronnie's legacy built on real recorded performances, rather than a digital projection, standing in his place on stage. Part of what made the hologram debate so heated is that it touched a nerve most fans hadn't had to confront before. Tribute bands and cover acts had existed for decades without controversy, because nobody watching one was confused about what they were seeing. A hologram synced to a dead man's real voice occupies a much stranger space, close enough to the real thing that some fans described feeling genuinely emotional in the room, while others described feeling like they were watching something closer to a magic trick than a memorial. That split isn't really about the technology itself. It's about two very different ideas of what honoring an artist is supposed to look like. One built around recreating the experience of seeing them perform, the other built around simply preserving what they actually did while they were alive and letting that stand on its own. It's a strange case study in how differently an estate can handle the same basic instinct, the desire to keep an artist present after they're gone. On one hand, restraint, years of sitting on unfinished songs rather than rushing them to market. On the other, a very public, very expensive experiment in bringing a version of Ronnie back on stage that ended up dividing the exact community it was meant to honor and unify. The hologram wasn't the only piece of Ronnie's story that kept resurfacing years after his death. His catalog has continued to expand in smaller, steadier ways that rarely make headlines, but keep adding new pieces to the picture fans have of him. In the years following his death, BMG released a series of remastered reissues of his solo albums, timed around the 10th anniversary of his passing, giving longtime fans cleaned-up versions of records some hadn't revisited in years. His Black Sabbath-era albums, Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, also received expanded reissue treatment, packaged with additional material for fans willing to dig deeper into that specific chapter of his career. In 2021, a posthumous autobiography, Rainbow in the Dark, was finally published, co-written with veteran rock journalist Mick Wall. What makes that book particularly interesting is that it wasn't assembled entirely from scratch after Ronnie died. Reporting around its release has indicated the manuscript was already substantially written before his death, meaning fans finally got to hear large portions of his own account of his career in his own words, delayed by roughly a decade before it finally reached shelves. A year after that, a fully authorized documentary titled Dreamers Never Die arrived, tracing his career from his earliest days in Elf all the way through his final project with Heaven and Hell. Wendy has said in multiple interviews that the goal of the film was to let audiences see the version of Ronnie that existed offstage, someone she's described as warm, thoughtful, and far gentler than his mythic, fire and brimstone stage persona might suggest. She's also spoken about how emotional the process of making that film was for her personally, digging back through decades of footage and memories to help shape how her husband would ultimately be remembered. Wendy has also used her interviews over the years to fill in some of the quieter, more personal parts of Ronnie's life that rarely made it into magazine profiles while he was alive. His close friendships with other iconic frontmen like Judas Priest's Rob Halford and Motorhead's Lemmy Kilmister, relationships built on mutual respect between performers who understood exactly what that level of fame demanded of a person. Those friendships extended well beyond music and speak to a side of Ronnie that his stage persona, all fire and mythology, never fully captured for the public. There's also a quieter thread running through all of this: the sheer scale of the archive itself. Decades of touring across essentially every continent left behind boxes upon boxes of live recordings, from arena shows in the United States to dates in Russia, Brazil, and countless other stops most fans never got detailed footage of at the time. Every so often, a piece of that touring history gets pulled out, restored, and released for the first time, giving longtime fans a genuinely new artifact from a career that otherwise feels fully cataloged. It's a reminder that an archive this large doesn't get exhausted quickly. There's still material being rediscovered, labeled, and evaluated years after anyone would have assumed the well had run dry. Between the archive she's still working through, the hologram experiment she's since stepped back from, and the steady stream of reissues, books, and documentaries still emerging more than a decade after his death, one thing is clear: managing Ronnie James Dio's estate never turned into the quiet, settled affair a lot of fans probably assumed it would be. It's been an ongoing, occasionally contentious process of figuring out how much of an artist's unfinished work deserves to see daylight, and how far is too far to go in trying to bring him back for an audience that still misses him. Ronnie James Dio spent his entire career being deliberate about his own work, holding songs back until they met a standard almost nobody else in the industry bothered to enforce. That instinct seems to have outlived him, at least in how his estate has generally handled his unfinished material. But the hologram experiment shows that even the most careful stewardship of a legacy can end up testing the goodwill of the very fans it's meant to serve. So with the documentary out, an autobiography finally published, reissues still rolling out, and a handful of unfinished songs reportedly still sitting in that storage locker somewhere, waiting for someone to decide they're finally ready. The bigger question hanging over all of it is whether finally ready is even a standard that can ever truly be met once the artist himself is no longer around to make that call. Wendy has made clear she's not interested in guessing at what Ronnie would have wanted just to satisfy demand, and that restraint, whatever you think of the hologram experiment, has at least kept his unfinished catalog from becoming the kind of posthumous cash grab that's damaged plenty of other legendary careers after death. What do you think should happen to the music Ronnie never got to finish? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Ronnie James Dio's legacy, make sure to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe for more untold stories from the world of music and entertainment. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload, and check out one of our other videos while you're here. Thanks for watching.